everyone. So, we are going to be in this episode looking at trauma and what that means and how it can affect us specifically in terms of leaving a high control group like the Jehovah's Witnesses. So, we've got Claire with us, who is a therapist and very experienced, and will hopefully be sharing a wealth of information with us. So, Claire, what would you say trauma is? If I said to you, what's trauma in a therapeutic sense, what is it?
I think it's a word that often gets used, isn't it, these days? We hear a lot about it and we can get mixed ideas about it. But trauma is really what goes on in your body when you've had a difficult experience, really intense experience that's put you in an unsafe environment and your body has had to respond. We often hear about fight, flight, freeze in the trauma framework.
Mhm.
So when your body is in a, when your body senses danger, it will respond immediately. So your thinking brain switches off and your emotional brain switches on, and it's life or death. You have to keep yourself safe. And what happens with trauma responses is that your brain continues to trigger and to feel unsafe in situations that are no longer the original event. And so we start to see patterns of hyperarousal of the nervous system, and people staying in a very traumatized state, even though the original danger is no longer there.
Okay, and
That makes it.
just out of interest, yeah, is it so trauma? The way I've sort of read up on it before is like it's actually a survival tactic. So we
Mm,
kind of had to act on trauma to survive as a species, and so it's kind of
absolutely.
like not necessarily avoidable. You will
No.
experience trauma.
Yes, if you have been in a situation where you are physically, emotionally unsafe, your body will respond. Yeah, it is an automatic response, and it is, yeah, to keep us alive, basically. And it has to be that way. But what we want our bodies to be able to do is to respond appropriately when we have been victims of trauma, of a really either one or many traumatic situations. Our body then can continue to flood us with hormones and continue to respond when it actually doesn't need to respond at that level. And that's when we see
Mhm.
these feelings in the body of being unsafe and overwhelmed. And it can be paralyzing because we're responding to that original thing that happened to us.
And would you say, I mean, just from experience of reading people's stories and things online, is that sometimes it's, somebody could have been in the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, and not necessarily had an actual event that they could pinpoint that was traumatic, as opposed to say somebody who was physically abused or sexually abused. So they might have a
Mm.
very specific thing, that event, but could you just have trauma just literally from being in a high control religion where you can't necessarily pinpoint any one event that happened, but just the general culture of that environment?
Yes, and there's different models of ways of understanding trauma, and we're still learning all the time. So it's important to say that their theories, what we have now, is understanding what goes on in the body. But sometimes it gets talked about as big T trauma and little t trauma. So, there might be these specific events where you may be diagnosed with something like PTSD if you've been in one particular event. If you've been in multiple events in which you were unsafe, that could be complex PTSD. And what we know in recovery from high control is that it used to be talked about as PTSD, but really it's over a period of time that your body's suppressed and that you're having to go into survival mode. So it's CPTSD that you experience. And it will be very different for each person that's exiting high control, what their own story and experience has been. But generally speaking, there will have been suppression of self. And so it's about how do we then learn to keep ourselves safe in the world when we haven't been taught how to respond appropriately to having boundaries and to knowing what danger is for us. Because often the cult
Yeah, that's
like dynamics will have reprogrammed that. They would have told us different things about how safe we are and not taught us to protect ourselves.
so. How does it manifest itself, maybe specifically in terms of coming out of a high control group?
So it's often, that feeling of being dysregulated can be very present, feeling an emotional overwhelm. And our brain looks for pattern matches as well. If there's something that will remind us of being in the high control situation. That can be all sorts of things. I was talking to a friend recently, and we're saying that ex Jehovah's Witnesses are probably unique in the fact that often we're a bit triggered by football stadiums because that's where we went and had our, days long experiences of being under high control. We're having to sit there as children and listen and be quiet. So our experience of going to a football stadium will be very different to someone that's never had that experience. Things might come back to our brain. So it can be anything to do with the five senses: sight, smell, taste, touch, whatever the other one is. Because they are the way that the body gathers cues really about what's going on around you. So you might suddenly feel 0 to 100 because you've heard a certain music or you've smelt a certain smell, and that's when the thinking brain switches off and the emotional brain, the amygdala, the part of your brain that is your emotional center, it starts to drive everything. And we can only learn to regulate that over time, of starting to understand that this isn't a danger response, this is an overdrive response, and that we can start to
Okay.
ground and regulate ourselves. I can't remember your original
That's
question.
yeah. No, that's really interesting because I had an experience. You just reminded me. So my grandmother was never a Jehovah's Witness, and my dad went into it when he was when we were very young, and my grandma died a couple of years ago. And she was always
Mm,
really against the witnesses because of the shunning that had happened in the family and various different things. But
yeah.
towards the end of her life, I think she kind of wanted to talk more about heaven or the afterlife and things like that. And she'd had a couple of conversations with my dad, and he arranged all of the funeral. So bearing in mind he's the only witness, him and his wife. As we were walking in, I heard this song, and it was a good job that we all had to wear face masks at the time. And even my brother and sister didn't recognise it because it was one of the newer JW
Mm,
songs, hymns, and
mm,
I just felt this overwhelming. I mean, it was emotional anyway. It was a funeral, and I was absolutely
mm,
furious about this. I was so
yeah.
angry and uh, really holding anything. That makes sense. It's kind of a reaction. It's
Mm,
like a
a trigger.
trauma-based thing of like it just triggered me into like feelings that I thought I'd put to
Mm,
bed all sort of rushed out again in that moment. So yeah,
yeah,
interesting.
absolutely. Really understandable. And in that moment, you're taken back into places, times, experiences where you felt very controlled, I'd imagine.
Yeah,
What was it
absolutely.
like
Yeah,
coming out of
yeah.
that? How
Really
did you
interesting.
recover from that?
I talked about it as we've said
Mm,
before. I think or we will talk in some other episodes about talking is really important, and I sort of said to my sister about it.
mm,
What I tried to do, because in that moment as well, I actually reconnected with my cousin who I hadn't seen for many years, and I tried to focus on that element of the funeral, and I tried to think that,
mm,
not that I specifically believe in an afterlife, but I thought even though that music was playing, that if my grandma could see that my cousin and I were reunited and embracing one another, that she would be happy, and that kind of helped to take that
mm,
like anger, if that makes sense. And by the end of it, I could just
mm.
kind of go, "Oh my goodness, you can't believe what my dad did," and it dissipated. I think that it looked for something positive out whatever's come up in that moment.
And it's interesting what you did was focus on what was going on in the present moment, that conversation with
Mm,
your cousin, being in the moment. And that's what we know can help to ground us when we've had a trauma trigger, is actually finding something that brings us back into our body and into the present moment and grounds us
mm-mm.
and reminds us that we're not there. You're not back in Nicole in the high control. You're here,
Yeah,
you're on the other side, you're
yeah,
free. And that can be powerful.
yeah, yeah. I know that does make sense. Kyle, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm not really adding anything. I'm listening to you there, Shelley. That really sucks. I'm sorry.
It's
That
weird.
really sucks. But good that you got connected with your cousin. For anyone dealing with that trauma response, I think it's important to know that you're not alone. I mean, Claire, you said that it's very much, this is a unique in the sense of football stadiums being a trigger. We all smile at that, but it's true. Remember
Mm,
sitting there, and I wouldn't encourage an 8-year-old to sit down, shut up for at least 4 to 6 hours, but yet
mm,
we were, and that's what we were made to do. I'd like to reiterate that point. You're not alone. Anyone listening to
mm,
this, you're not on your own with any of these. Don't panic. I mean, there's other episodes we've recorded that we've all ended up in tears through one trigger or another. And most of us have been out for years and it still affects us to this day. And trauma isn't something that can ever really it's not something that leaves you. I'm sure you'd agree with this, Claire. It has to be worked out and worked on. And it's not an illness. You're not unwell. There is something there that needs working on, but it's not an illness. It's not like a cold or a flu where you can take a pill and move on. Takes time.
It's the opposite, really. It's your body doing everything to try to keep you safe. So when we see it like that, when we understand actually, my body's completely on my side, it's trying to protect me, we can be compassionate towards our own body and we can say, okay, it's just overreacting because it did have to do that back then. It did have to keep me safe. But now I can start to reassure my body that the traumatized parts of me, that actually it's okay now. And I'm here to protect those parts of me and to keep them safe. And I'm in a different mindset now.
I do not permit the women to speak. Yes, there we are. Shelley triggered straight away.
Mm.
So let's look at,
Yep.
yeah, instantly. Actually, there was something funny I watched this morning, and the person who had left was talking about the pre-convention, and you would like put all the chairs out, and there was always that there's two types of sisters on those pre-conventions.
Hmm.
There was one there there was the ones there that stood and watched all the brothers look how many chairs, all these big and strong ears. And there's the other ones that were actually carrying these sisters, and they were always carrying lots on their arms and stuff like that. They're probably the ones that are out now. But I just wanted to look at these very specific traumas because denial of free speech is overwhelming in high control groups. In fact, it's actually part of the model is
Mm.
control speech. Claire, what sort of advice
Mm.
would you give to someone that is trying to
Mm.
deal with that trauma?
Yes, and I do hear what you're saying, absolutely. It's a patriarchal organisation and women weren't allowed to have a voice. At the same time, in some other ways, men also perhaps didn't get to have a voice because they were expected to be a certain way. They were given a message they had to deliver. If they're in positions of leadership, that's what they had to go and tell people. This is what you do. So there's kind of suppression in both genders. I see that we need to recognise that in different ways. Different types of suppression. But the model of therapy that I work with in post-court recovery, with the training I did with Dr. Julie Jenkinson, she focuses on the concept of not being an echo. And she uses the Greek mythology story about Narcissus. The part that we don't often get to hear is about a little nymph called Echo. Now, Echo in the Greek mythology, a curse put on her, and she loses her voice and she can only echo what anyone else says. And she eventually withers away and dies because she can't get her needs met, because all she can do is repeat others. And it really resonates with how we are in a cult environment. We just regurgitate what we're told. And so we get no sense of our own sense of self, our own healthy sense of who we are and being able to voice our own needs. Really, it comes that sort of suppression of our voice. The way that we start to heal from that is by working out, how do we start to have a voice? How can we use our voice to have a healthy sense of self and speak out and not be suppressed? But it comes from understanding this part of what we were under.
You've touched on something there that perhaps I was a little bit ignorant to. You obviously treat ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. You've mentioned that both genders suffer, would you say it's equally?
In different ways. I think, we don't want to sort of put percentages on, but differently. But both have suffered from suppression. So obviously the male pathway within the organisation of Jehovah's Witnesses is very patriarchal. They were channeled, males were channeled in a certain direction. Women were only allowed to go so far and then kept suppressed. The pressures are different. Some are actually pushed to go into leadership roles maybe that they didn't want to be in, didn't want to have to enforce the rules on the women. And,
And
for the
equally,
women, yeah,
some
some
may
may
have
have,
wanted to
yeah,
be an elder,
yeah,
a servant, but never quite got made the grade, so to speak, and felt that
very
they
true, yeah.
needed a voice and never got that. So
Yeah,
that
they were
element of it
kept
as
down,
well.
maybe told they're not good enough. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's all different angles of how it can affect us. And I think it's about not saying that one is more harmful from the other, because depending on your own experience, that would have been really damaging to your sense of self. It's understanding it from all the different aspects.
Yeah. I think actually it must be really traumatic for many elders to be an elder, because I know some of them, you can maybe think of people that kind of reveled in the power, but a
Mm,
lot of people I remember are probably really genuinely nice people and wanted to help people and do the best for people,
absolutely.
and yet they
Yeah.
are traumatized by having to diagnose from a book or dictate what's said to that person from some books that were written by 8 blokes or guided by these men in New York who they don't even know, and
Mm.
that is quite traumatic as well, I think.
Very much so. I remember, so my dad was an elder for many years. I remember my dad saying to me, if you knew what elders had to listen to, some of the stories that we hear, you'd turn your hair curlier than it already is. And I just remember now him saying that and thinking, wow, what did he have to listen to? And yet there's no outlet for them. They don't have supervision where they go and talk about what the effects of hearing all this stuff is on them, or how they work with congregation members, to keep them safe. None of that. There's no professional guidance. And they're just left to sit with it.
Very,
Mm,
and then equally, because they've not got that guidance and outlet, then that's then maybe reflected in the way they deal with people. And I
yeah.
can imagine then when they're coming out of that, perhaps they feel guilty for, um, certain ways that they maybe dealt with people in like judicial settings and all that kind of thing that goes with that as well.
There we go.
Judicial is a
Yeah.
horrible thing, really, you know. And
Yeah.
I remember somebody said to me, "Oh, well, it's not judgmental." And I'm like, "But it's called judicial. That's judgment.
Mm,
What is it? It's that's what you're calling it. Of course it
mm-hmm.
is." Um, Absolutely
Hugely.
insane, really. It's like gaslighting that they can do with these words
Mm,
and
to say.
things. But
Yeah, I mean they're deciding people's fate, aren't they? You either stay in an
yeah,
organisation or you get expelled from it. And yes, it's some love that power, but some actually, in the case, three of them deciding, but it's still an awful thing to have to sit with, knowing that the harm that will ensue from that decision.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
And no wonder there's a high level of depression and anxiety. I mean, I think
mm,
it's probably more. I think the sort of ratio of people with maybe emotional and psychological problems in the witnesses, I think is actually quite high, maybe compared to
mm.
society in general. I mean, I know that we have a lot of mental illness and things, but in general, but
Mm.
I think the ratio must be higher in witnesses. I don't know if there are any
Yeah, and
statistics
it's
to prove that, but it certainly feels that way from my recollection.
Gilly has done lots of research, and I think that's what we're saying, isn't it? Research is important to understand experience. So Gilly's done a doctoral PhD looking at cult survivors. What is it that helps them recover? So she's a trained therapist, and she wasn't in Jehovah's Witnesses. She was in a Christian-based cult that she joined as a young woman and left several years later. So she has that experience, but she's worked over the years with many ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and she's quite well known as a therapist now in the post-cult community. But she has developed a model that she has trained some therapists to work with recovery, and it's all of these aspects of understanding trauma. And she really wants us to try and have a psychological understanding when we're working with our clients, helping unlayer, unmask the psychological control mechanisms that cults use, so that first of all, we can leave physically, we can leave mentally, psychologically, and then we can recover emotionally. Because the danger that she said is if people don't do that groundwork, that foundational work, and they go to therapy, they're actually then working with what she calls the cult pseudo identity. The controlled identity is still there, it's still present. And so the therapist is not really understanding that a lot of the responses that the client will be given are based on what they've been conditioned to be in the cult environment. So that psychoeducational is a vital unlocking of a part of the recovery to move forward. So she's quite a fascinating person to have moved therapy forward in the post-cult world.
So let's quickly show her book off a bit, shall we? First of all, look how thick it is. It'll give you an idea.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, got the paper. So it's nice and thick.
Mm-hmm.
There's more information in there than you could ever probably use. It's called Walking Free from the Trauma of Cultic and Spiritual Abuse, and it's actually almost a self-help book that you can go through. There's lots of things that you come along, you colour in, you draw, and you fill in different parts, and it's like that all the way through. And we've got to hopefully Julie gets to see this. We've got to commend both her and the producers of that book. It's absolutely cracking, absolutely brilliant.
Oh, so the model of therapy that I use is based on that book. So I do the therapy workbook version with my clients, and that's why we are able to see the progress, because it's a framework that you can refer back to. Okay, we've covered these parts. You know, I'm not just trauma dumping. That's another thing we probably need to talk about as well when we're talking about trauma, is that it can just all come out in one big tumble and it's hard to make sense of. You can feel quite flooded, emotionally flooded, if you do that on a regular basis in therapy. So this model gives the framework so that we can say, okay, this is what we're working through. You can reference back to that, you can understand it, and it's milestones as you go along in your recovery process.
And how can you get a copy of that book?
We can give the link. It's published by Routledge. It's available on Amazon. Easy to get hold of.
Okay, fab.
Yeah.
I need to get me one.
One of I think so. I think a lot of people are getting hold of it. It does feel a bit overwhelming at first because it is big, but don't forget, you can use my version of what I do with reading books, which I call dippy books. You can dip in and out. So you might find there's a topic in there in the index that makes sense to you. I'm really drawn to that. I'm going to read that bit. I'm going to dip into that bit. You know, you've got it there. You can go from beginning to an end when you want to. But if you just want to look at a certain worksheet, it does stand alone in a way. You can say, right, I'm going to look at anger, boundaries, shame and guilt, whatever resonates with you.
So in terms of recovery, do we recover? Do people recover? You know, if you talk about a cancer, for example, you might have a remission, you might be cured, that cancer might be no longer present with you. It doesn't feel like it's like that with trauma. So can you recover fully from trauma?
You can, absolutely. I think it's really important that we are affirmative about that. You can recover. You know, the brain has amazing ability, has neuroplasticity. It can rewire the pathway. And so that's when we do the work of grounding, understanding trauma, we can start to then be in triggering situation, and we might still get a little bit triggered, but it becomes less and less, and we know how to ground ourselves, and over time we get to a place of containment, and it does lead to a recovery.
So the recovery is like what we discussed before. It's like, well, that's really made these feelings overwhelm me, but I've now got the resources, I've now got the know-how to like calm myself, to settle myself and bring myself back to a place of peace. And actually then further down the line, some of those things that may well have triggered you barely recognize them. They're no longer triggers
Yeah,
as such. It's just gone,
absolutely.
and it's
Yeah.
not, the brain hasn't even recognized it.
When I was training as a therapist, my tutor said something that I always remembered, because she said, you come as a therapist with your own stuff, your own life story. So the way that the training works is that it helps you identify where the bruises are on your body, so that when a client comes to a session and brings something that you really identify with, you're aware of the fact they might press on that. You know that, you're aware because you've done the work yourself. It doesn't mean the bruise isn't there, but it might get less over time, and you become more aware of what you need to do maybe after that session to make sure that what the client has brought isn't triggering you. And I think the same works with our own personal recovery. We get to know, okay, I know what my triggers are. Maybe I'm not going to go to that place, or I'm not going to do that thing because I know that that wouldn't really be good for me. So you start to be able to anticipate a bit more and protect yourself, put boundaries in place where you wouldn't have done before, and that can be really healthy.
Absolutely.
One of the things we look at in recovery workbook is understanding the difference between rage, hot rage and cold rage, and healthy anger and boundary setting. And that's really important in understanding trauma, because a lot of anger can be in our system when we realise we've been a victim of trauma. And that can either go outwards and be very explosive, or we can sink into depression, self-harm, very inward, harmful practices. When we start to understand how to express it in a healthy way, having a voice, like we've spoken about earlier, not having that suppression, and also setting boundaries, saying no, stating our needs within relationship, then we start to operate in a different framework, and we don't then fly off into these triggers and respond either harmfully towards ourselves or towards other people, because we're much more contained.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on anger. That's something I really noticed when I probably noticed it a lot when I joined like Facebook groups and things, you know,
Mm,
started to listen to other people's comments. And I think anger really is massively prevalent, and like you
Mm,
say, it can take different forms. And is it when's it not healthy anymore? When do you have to kind of let it go because it's
mm,
destroying you inside? Like, just to be constantly angry that that happened,
yeah.
constantly, I might be angry that I was denied going to university, for it as an example. A lot of people feel that I was denied
Mm,
that because I was told that I needed to go and pioneer, and that the end of the world was coming and it was more important to do this. And now I'm in my 40s, 50s, and I don't feel like I've fulfilled what I wanted to do, and I'm angry about that. Either, like you say, we can let that go, then put it into moving yourself forward and think, well, actually, no, I can do that now. Don't be angry.
mm,
Or let that anger
mm.
move you then to go, actually, well, what's stopping me now? I can do that if I want to. It might be a bit harder to do, but that's just one example. Using it to move yourself
Yeah,
forward instead.
yeah, that energy can then, as you said, can propel you into healthy action.
Yeah,
I think it's a really good way of seeing it, because it
yeah.
can either keep you stuck,
And I think
which isn't how you move
exactly,
forward.
yeah. And
Mm,
maybe there's another episode that we've got about activism, advocacy and
mm,
activism, and talking about the various forms of it. And we touched on kind of fairly aggressive forms, which are probably born
mm,
from intense anger of a really awful, horrid experience, a very, very
yeah.
traumatic experiences that people have had. And you can
Mm,
understand why that would perhaps really make them feel that angry, that they want to be quite aggressive in their activism.
mm.
I mean, the discussion in that episode is whether it's effective or not, but you can certainly start to understand why some people feel so driven to be quite extreme.
You can really understand it. Yeah, it needs an outlet in some way. But it is thinking about, yeah, what harm is this going to do to me or others? Is this healthy? Is this actually achieving
Mm,
something? Often we see very intense form of activism. Activists will burn out because it just becomes
yeah,
too much for them. And that's sad to see somebody reach a point where they just have to sort of completely withdraw themselves from the community because it just becomes too harmful for them. We wouldn't want somebody to really keep doing that. We want to see healthier ways of activism. And we talk in another episode about, how can we healthily get, those that can make helpful changes to law or in government, powers that be, or even, charities, mental health organisations. How can we get people like that on board when we're fighting a very immovable organisation like the Jehovah's Witnesses? It's almost like bashing your head, isn't it, against something really solid. It's
hmm
painful. When we start to look at other ways of doing things that can actually evoke positive change for future generations of people that are going to leave, that becomes really meaningful, and that's something that we can chip away at over time, and it gives us satisfaction and hope.
yeah,
It's a different way of
absolutely.
seeing
And,
things.
and like you say, it doesn't have to be a full-time occupation as such, but you can dip into
Mm,
things, can't you? And I guess as a person who's come away from it after a number of years, I think all the time you talked about bruises, and we know where our bruises are and what might trigger us. And I think
mm,
the experience of people who have been out for a long time and worked their way through that and are more kind of proficient, if you like, at recognizing it and having like sort of healthy boundaries with how much they get involved, can be really, really helpful to new ones coming out, because you've
yeah,
just got that experience,
yeah.
which is immeasurable.
Definitely. And I think you said earlier on about angry ex-member groups. There are some really angry ones out there. So it's just being aware, is this environment that I'm part of, is it healthy for me? Or is it just keeping me in that traumatized place where I keep feeling triggered? And so being very aware of what we surround ourselves with when we're in recovery. When we're traumatized,
Yeah.
we're very vulnerable. And we need to really be taking care of ourselves and keeping ourselves away from being re-traumatized, which isn't helpful.
We haven't got time to go
Mm.
into them all. Obviously, we've got to try and fit this in, all of this into half an hour. But what other methods of therapy are there for someone dealing with this? Or would you say that's too broad a question to answer?
In some ways it is. Again, therapy is about the relationship. We've said this in other parts of the podcast. Having a good relationship with the therapist can be everything, no matter what methods they use. But ultimately, you want to be looking at the whole experience of not going back into talking about the trauma, but talking about where the trauma came from. with a trauma-informed therapist. Now, there are all sorts of certificates and short courses that can be done to say you work with trauma, but you really want somebody that knows and has worked longer term with traumatized clients, because it is deep work. It needs a holding and containing environment, because you need to be able to feel safe enough to express the overwhelm. And if a therapist doesn't feel confident doing that, you will pick up on that and feel unsafe. So you don't want to put yourself into a situation where the therapist doesn't really know what they're dealing with. So really ask them, if you're wanting to go and work through trauma, ask them about what they have done with trauma work, and don't be afraid of really questioning how long they've worked with it and what qualifications they have, and go away and check with somebody that might know about that, so that you're keeping yourself safe.
Well, thanks, Claire. It's so insightful, as always, to talk to you. Do join us for the later episodes where Claire features as well, because they are really interesting if this is something that you're interested in or dealing with. There's more information on those ones too. But yeah, thanks very much. It's been great to
Thank you, Jen.
talk about this, and
Good
I
to
think
be
something
invited.
we all can relate to.
Thank you
No
so much,
worries.
Claire.
Thanks.
Thank you, Carl.
Cheers.
Thanks.